In the early morning hours of June 17, 1971, 5 men in dark suits and surgical gloves broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. What they didn't know was that they were about to trigger the greatest constitutional crisis in modern American history. This is the story of how a simple burglary became the scandal that brought down a president, and how the cover-up became far worse than the crime. The Watergate scandal lasted just over 2 years, but in those 25 months, it would expose the darkest corners of power, destroy careers, land government officials in prison, and do something that had never happened before: force a sitting president to resign in disgrace. This is how democracy nearly failed, and how it survived. To understand why 5 men were creeping through the Watergate building that night, we need to go back. We need to go back to a time when the President of the United States felt like his world was closing in on him. By 1971, President Richard Nixon was fighting a war on 2 fronts. Abroad, American soldiers were still dying in Vietnam, but at home, the war was different. It was a war of secrets. And Nixon believed that traitors were everywhere, in his government, in the media, even within his own intelligence agencies. In June 1971, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, a classified history of American involvement in Vietnam. Nixon was furious. The leak revealed that previous administrations, including Kennedy's, had expanded the war in secret. But it also showed something that terrified him. Government secrets could be exposed, and the person responsible was Daniel Ellsberg, a former Defense Department analyst. Nixon made a decision. He would create a secret unit inside the White House to stop leaks and investigate his enemies. He called them the Plumbers, because their job was to stop leaks in the government. And their headquarters, room 16 of the old Executive Office building, just a short walk from the Oval Office. The man Nixon chose to lead this operation was a former FBI agent named G. Gordon Liddy. Liddy was uncompromising, ruthless, and entirely willing to do whatever it took to protect the president. He believed absolutely that the ends justified the means. He once told a colleague, "If you want anyone killed, just let me know." But Liddy wasn't alone. Working alongside him was E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA officer who had spent 2 decades in the espionage business. Hunt was a novelist in his spare time, and he treated the world like it was a spy thriller. He updated his entry in Who's Who to list the White House as his office. Together, Liddy and Hunt planned operations that would have seemed unthinkable if they weren't true. They organized a break-in at the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist in California, hoping to find dirt they could use to discredit him. They plotted to firebomb the Brookings Institution, a think tank in Washington. They were, in many ways, the first political dirty trick squad operating in the shadows with the implicit blessing of the highest levels of the Nixon White House. But in 1972, Liddy and Hunt turned their attention to something bigger. That year would be a presidential election, and President Nixon wanted to know what the Democrats were planning. So he authorized them to conduct intelligence gathering. Not just gathering, he authorized them to break in and bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters. To carry out this operation, Hunt and Liddy assembled a team. They recruited Bernard Barker, a former CIA operative Hunt had known since the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. They brought in men with military and intelligence backgrounds. They interviewed a dozen potential operatives in Miami. Barker bragged to Liddy that his men had killed 22 people between them. They spent weeks preparing. They cased the Watergate building. They mapped security patrols. They identified the location of the Democratic National Committee offices. They planned exactly how to get in, photograph documents, and plant listening devices. Every detail was choreographed. Everything was planned. Nothing was left to chance. In May 1972, they made their first attempt. Liddy and Hunt watched from a nearby hotel room as their operatives broke into the DNC offices, photographed files, and installed listening devices. The operation appeared to be a success, but when the results were reviewed, there was a problem. The listening devices were malfunctioning. They would have to go back in. June 17, 1972. Just before 2:30 the morning, 5 men dressed in suits and wearing surgical gloves are inside the Democratic National Committee offices. They're photographing files. They're installing new listening devices. They have no idea that a security guard named Frank Wills has just discovered their entry point. Within minutes, Washington, D.C. police officers are racing to the Watergate. Within an hour, 5 men are in custody. The burglars are identified as Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, James McCord, Eugenio Martinez, and Felipe de Diego. Within days, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy are also implicated. At first, the Nixon White House tried to distance itself from the break-in. White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called it a third-rate burglary. But the problem was this: the burglars had cash on them. The police traced that cash, and the cash led directly back to Nixon's re-election committee. The question was no longer whether the burglars worked for the Nixon campaign. The question was, how much did the president know? And that's when everything changed. That's when the cover-up began. Immediately after the arrests, the Nixon administration went into damage control. The president's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, described as a Berlin Wall around the president, was one of Nixon's most trusted aides. Within hours of the break-in, Nixon and Haldeman were in the Oval Office, planning their response. 3 days after the arrests, on June 20, 1972, Nixon made a crucial decision. He ordered the CIA to tell the FBI to back off the investigation. He would later claim he did this for national security reasons. But the truth captured on one of his secret White House recordings told a different story. "Stay the hell out of this. This is some business here. We don't want you to go any further on it." This conversation, recorded just 6 days after the break-in, would later become known as the smoking gun tape. On it, the President of the United States is explicitly ordering the obstruction of a federal investigation. But at the time, no one knew about this tape. No one knew that Nixon had been recording his own conversations all along. Meanwhile, inside the Nixon administration, a lawyer named John Dean was coordinating the response. Dean was the White House counsel, the legal advisor to the president. He was 33 years old, ambitious, and willing to do what needed to be done to protect the administration. But what he didn't know was that his decisions would eventually lead to him testifying against the president. Over the following weeks and months, Dean coordinated a complex scheme. They paid hush money to the burglars to keep them quiet. They arranged for the burglars' legal fees to be paid through a slush fund operated by Nixon's re-election committee. They worked with senior administration officials to coach witnesses. They essentially bought the silence of the conspirators. E. Howard Hunt, one of the burglars' handlers, demanded $120,000. He said if he didn't get it, he would tell about seamy things he had done for top White House officials. The cover-up became a careful dance of payments and promises. By September 1972, the administration had essentially bought 3 months of silence from the defendants. November 7, 1972. President Nixon stood on the precipice of victory. He had defeated Democrat George McGovern in one of the most lopsided elections in American history. Nixon won 60.7% of the popular vote. He carried 49 of 50 states. Only Massachusetts, McGovern's home state, voted against him. It was a vindication, Nixon believed. It was proof that the American people supported him and his vision for the country. It was the moment of triumph he had always sought. But in the midst of the celebrations, Nixon was brooding. He knew that the Watergate investigation was continuing. He knew that questions were being asked, and he knew that time was running out. The following weeks would prove to be the most critical of the entire scandal. The cover-up would shift into overdrive. More payments would be made. More witnesses would be coached. More lies would be told. And the web of conspiracy would grow larger. By March 1973, President Nixon was worried. The trial of the original burglars had begun. Prosecutors were asking questions about where the money had come from. The walls were closing in. And so Nixon called John Dean to the Oval Office. It was March 21, 1973. This meeting would become one of the most significant conversations in American political history. In this conversation, Dean told the president exactly what he needed to hear and needed to know. He explained that E. Howard Hunt was demanding money, a lot of money. He explained that people were talking. He explained that the cover-up was failing. And he made a famous statement. There is a cancer growing on the presidency. Those 6 words, there is a cancer growing on the presidency, would haunt Nixon for the rest of his life. Dean was telling the president that the cover-up itself had become worse than the original crime, that it was eating away at the presidency from the inside, that it needed to be surgically removed, In that same conversation, captured on Nixon's secret recording system, the president and his counsel discussed raising money for the defendants. They discussed the logistics of the payoff. They discussed the obstruction of justice. And when Dean worried that raising $1 million would be difficult, Nixon whispered, moving closer to avoid the microphones he thought might be listening, "Well, that's an obstruction of justice." Nixon knew. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was obstruction of justice, and he was willing to do it anyway. At that very moment, a Senate committee was being formed to investigate the scandal. Led by Senator Sam Ervin, the Watergate Committee would eventually hold televised hearings, and those hearings would bring the scandal directly into American living rooms. But first, another bombshell had to explode. On July 16, 1973, a man named Alexander Butterfield sat before the Senate Watergate Committee and dropped a bombshell. Butterfield was an aide to H.R. Haldeman, and he had a secret to tell. President Nixon, he revealed, had installed a secret recording system in the Oval Office. Every conversation in that room had been recorded. Every admission, every denial, every discussion of payoffs and obstruction of justice, everything was on tape. The implications were staggering. The tapes were evidence. The tapes were potentially the most important evidence in the entire scandal. If the investigators could get those tapes, they could prove exactly what the president knew and when he knew it. And so began a desperate battle. Nixon fought with every tool at his disposal to prevent those tapes from being released. In October 1973, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox demanded the tapes. Nixon refused. Cox pushed harder. Nixon ordered him fired. The Attorney General resigned rather than fire Cox. His deputy resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork, third in command at the Justice Department, fired Cox. It became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, a constitutional crisis that threatened to tear apart the separation of powers itself. But by the summer of 1974, the noose was tightening. The Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to surrender the tapes. And on August 5, 1974, one tape in particular, recorded on June 23, 1972, was released to the public. This tape, the smoking gun tape, was the final nail in the coffin. On it, Nixon and Haldeman were heard formulating a plan to block the FBI investigation of the Watergate break-in by having the CIA falsely claim to the FBI that national security was involved. It was explicit obstruction of justice. And it came from the president himself. Within 72 hours, the House of Representatives began impeachment proceedings. The House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend impeachment on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Moderate Republicans who had defended Nixon finally turned against him. Even Nixon's own lawyers told him the case was hopeless. On August 8, 1974, exactly 2 years and 1 month after the Watergate break-in, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. He was about to make history. "I shall resign the presidency, effective at noon tomorrow." Those words, spoken by President Nixon in a televised address to the nation on August 8, 1974, marked an unprecedented moment in American history. No president had ever resigned before. The implications were profound. The precedent was historic. In his address, Nixon claimed he had always acted in the best interests of the nation. He claimed the Watergate scandal had become a distraction. He claimed that he no longer had the political support in Congress to continue governing. But he never admitted guilt. He never took full responsibility. He never truly explained to the American people what he had done. The following morning, at noon on August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon boarded a helicopter on the south lawn of the White House. As he waved goodbye, his presidency was over. Vice President Gerald Ford became the 38th President of the United States. But the scandal wasn't over. The trials were just beginning. The convictions were about to start. And some of the most important questions about the scandal remained unanswered. Questions about what the president had known. Questions about when he had known it. Questions about how far he had been willing to go to hold on to power. In 1974 and 1975, the trials of the key conspirators took place. The 5 original burglars pleaded guilty or were convicted. But the real focus was on the higher-ups. In March 1974, a grand jury indicted former Attorney General John Mitchell, former White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, former domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman, and others for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. John Mitchell, who had once been Nixon's closest political confidant, and who had directed much of the campaign dirty tricks operation, sat in a federal courtroom facing prison time. Haldeman, the man Nixon had relied on to manage his office, faced conviction. Ehrlichman, another top aide, was on trial for his role in coordinating the cover-up and coaching witnesses. In January 1975, the jury reached a verdict. Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman were convicted on multiple counts. Mitchell received a sentence of 2 to 8 years in prison, eventually serving 19 months. Haldeman received a sentence of 2.5 to 8 years, eventually serving 18 months. Ehrlichman received the same, serving 18 months. Gordon Liddy, who had refused to testify before the grand jury, was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and illegal wiretapping. He served 52 months in federal prison, more than 4 years. John Dean, who had turned against the president and testified for the prosecution, was charged with obstruction of justice. He pleaded guilty and served 4 months in a federal prison camp. Even the white-collar criminals who worked in the highest levels of government were going to prison. In total, 48 government officials were convicted or pleaded guilty to crimes related to the Watergate scandal and the cover-up. 48 people, 7 of them received prison sentences in excess of 1 year. The scandal had touched the highest levels of power: cabinet members, presidential aides, the president's closest advisors, and they were all held accountable. But there remained one person who would never face trial for his role in the scandal, and that person was Richard Nixon himself. On September 8, 1974, exactly 1 month after becoming president, Gerald Ford made an extraordinary decision. He would pardon Richard Nixon. Not just a pardon, but a full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes Nixon may have committed while president. No trial, no conviction, no justice. Ford claimed he was doing this for the good of the nation. He said that healing the country was more important than pursuing justice. He said that continuing the legal battle would be too divisive. He said that Nixon had already suffered enough. I have concluded that only I can do that. And if I can, I must. But the American people were furious. They had watched as cabinet members went to prison, as presidential aides served time, as government officials were held accountable. And then the man at the center of it all, the man who had orchestrated the obstruction of justice, who had authorized the payments, who had ordered the cover-up, was pardoned. No consequences, no trial, no justice. Ford's approval rating dropped from 71% to 50% in a single day. The Republican Party lost 43 seats in the House and 4 inches the Senate in the midterm elections that November. 2 years later, Ford lost his bid for a full term as president to Jimmy Carter. Historians believe the pardon was the decisive factor. By trying to heal the nation, Ford had divided it. By trying to move forward, he had ensured that the wounds would never fully close. Richard Nixon retired to San Clemente, California, to a fortress-like compound overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He would spend the next 20 years writing books, writing his memoirs, attempting to rehabilitate his image. He would give speeches. He would serve as an elder statesman on foreign policy. He would become a respected voice on American-Soviet relations. The man who had been forced to resign would, in his later years, be invited back into polite society. And yet, for many Americans, the pardon remained unfinished business. It remained an open wound. It was a reminder that even in America, even with all its constitutional protections and checks and balances, the most powerful people could escape accountability. The Watergate scandal lasted 25 months. It brought down a presidency. It landed government officials in prison. It exposed corruption at the highest levels of power. But what did it mean? What were the lessons? And what could the American people learn from this unprecedented constitutional crisis? First, Watergate revealed the power of the presidency. It showed that a president could, if willing to go that far, use the apparatus of government to obstruct justice, to pay off potential witnesses, to coordinate a massive cover-up. It showed the vulnerability of the constitutional system to abuse by those who hold power. But Watergate also revealed something else: the resilience of that same constitutional system. The press, Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, had investigated the scandal and reported the truth to the American people. Congress had held hearings and subpoenaed evidence. The courts had forced the president to surrender the tapes. The system, tested to its limits, had held. John Dean, the man who had coordinated much of the cover-up, ultimately became the prosecution's key witness. He broke ranks. He testified against the president. He chose accountability over loyalty. His decision changed everything. Second, Watergate showed that even presidents are not above the law. Or at least, that's what most of the nation believed. 48 government officials were held accountable. Some served prison time. Some lost their careers. Some lost their freedom. The message sent to future administrations was clear. Breaking the law carries consequences, even for the most powerful. Third, Watergate revealed the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corruption that power can bring. Nixon had won a landslide election. He had the political power to govern as he wished, but that power became intoxicating. It led him to believe that he was above the law. It led him to believe that the ends winning at all costs, crushing his enemies, maintaining power justified the means. Over 40 years later, Watergate remains the most significant political scandal in modern American history. It reshaped the presidency. It changed how America approached government accountability. It created new ethics rules. It created new disclosure requirements. It demonstrated that oversight of the executive branch was not just desirable, it was essential. The people involved in the Watergate scandal, both the conspirators and the truth-tellers, would spend the rest of their lives defined by those 25 months. Some redeemed themselves, others never recovered. John Dean served his time in prison and then largely retreated from public life. In his later years, he would occasionally speak about Watergate and defend his decision to cooperate with prosecutors. He became a symbol of redemption, the man who had chosen the right path when the pressure was greatest. G. Gordon Liddy served more time in prison than any other conspirator, 52 months. He emerged from prison embittered but also in some ways admiring of those who had stood by their convictions. He wrote his memoir, Will, which described the burglary and the scandal from his perspective. Later in life, he became a radio talk show host and media personality. Remarkably, he developed a friendship with Timothy Leary, the former LSD guru, and they toured the country giving debates on free will and government authority. H.R. Haldeman served 18 months in federal prison. After his release, he wrote his own memoirs, defending his role in the scandal and attempting to explain his perspective. But he never fully escaped the shadow of Watergate. He died in 1993, still defending his decisions. John Mitchell, Nixon's former attorney general and the man who had overseen much of the campaign's dirty tricks, served 19 months in federal prison. He emerged from prison a broken man. He died in 1988, and while his obituary mentioned his role as attorney general and his tenure as campaign manager, Watergate was the defining moment of his career and his life. Richard Nixon lived for 20 years after his resignation, until 1994. He wrote 9 books. He became an elder statesman. He traveled the world. He gave lectures. In his final years, he was even invited to state dinners and treated with a degree of respect by political leaders. But the questions never went away. The wound never fully healed. Gerald Ford lived until 2006. He spent his post-presidential years defending his decision to pardon Nixon. In interviews later in life, he claimed he had done the right thing, that healing the nation was more important than prosecuting the former president. But for many Americans, that pardon remained the most controversial act of his presidency. Alexander Butterfield, the aide who revealed the existence of the secret tapes, later regretted that he had felt compelled to tell the truth. He believed his testimony had been a betrayal of Nixon. He spent his later years in relative privacy. But history remembers him as the man whose revelation may have been the most crucial testimony in the entire scandal. After 40 years, questions about Watergate remain. The full extent of Nixon's knowledge may never be known. Some tapes were destroyed. Some conversations were never recorded. The president took many secrets with him to the grave. But what we do know is this: a president abused his power. He tried to cover it up. He coordinated a conspiracy to obstruct justice. And yet, in the end, he was never tried. He was never convicted. He was never forced to serve time for his crimes. That paradox that the man at the center of the scandal was pardoned while his subordinates served time remains one of the most troubling aspects of the Watergate legacy. It suggests that even in a nation of laws, power can insulate you from consequences. It suggests that knowing the right people can mean the difference between prison and a comfortable retirement. It raises questions about justice, about fairness, about whether all Americans are truly equal before the law. And yet, for all its failures, Watergate also demonstrated the strength of American institutions. The press investigated and reported the truth. Congress held hearings and subpoenaed evidence. The courts enforced those subpoenas. A president was forced to resign. Government officials were prosecuted and imprisoned. In the end, the system worked, not perfectly, but it worked. Watergate taught us that no one, not the President of the United States, not his closest advisors, not the most powerful people in government, is above accountability. It taught us that secrecy in government is dangerous. It taught us that the cover-up is often worse than the crime. And it taught us that our system of government, while imperfect, is resilient enough to survive even the most profound constitutional crises. 7-0 day, 50 years after the Watergate break-in, the scandal remains a touchstone for discussions about government accountability, presidential power, and the limits of executive authority. Students learn about Watergate in history classes. Politicians reference Watergate when discussing ethics and governance. Watergate has become a metaphor for political corruption and cover-up. But perhaps the most important lesson of Watergate is this: democracy is not automatic. Democracy is not something that exists because it's written in a constitution. Democracy requires vigilance. It requires an informed citizenry. It requires a press willing to investigate power. It requires Congress willing to conduct oversight. It requires courts willing to enforce the law. And it requires citizens willing to demand accountability from those in power. June 17, 1972. 5 men in dark suits break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. They thought it was a simple burglary. They thought they would photograph documents, install listening devices, and be done. But in breaking into that office, they triggered a sequence of events that would bring down a presidency and shake the foundations of American governance. 50 years later, we're still learning lessons from Watergate. We're still asking questions about power. We're still wrestling with the balance between a strong executive and an accountable one. We're still asking, how much power should a president have? And how do we ensure that power is exercised responsibly? Watergate didn't destroy American democracy, but it came close. And it was only because the institutions designed to check presidential power, the press, the courts, the Congress functioned as they were supposed to function, that the system survived. That lesson, more than any other, is what Watergate teaches us about America and about ourselves. This is the story of Watergate, the story of power, the story of corruption, the story of cover-up, the story of a presidency brought down by a simple break-in, and the story of a nation that, despite its flaws, found the strength to hold even its most powerful citizens accountable.